The American supply convoy rounds the bend at 0230 hours, headlights cutting through the German forest like knives through black cloth. You've been waiting in this pine grove for 6 hours, explosives wired to the roadside, finger on the detonator that will send another dozen occupiers to hell. You are 16 years old. 3 months ago, you were attending classes and worrying about mathematics exams. Today, you're a member of Werewolf, the Nazi guerrilla organization tasked with making Allied occupation so costly that the victors will abandon Germany to its fate. Your Hitler youth training taught you to die for the fatherland. Now it's teaching you to kill for it. The convoy carries medical supplies for a field hospital treating wounded German civilians. You know this because you've been watching the Americans for weeks, learning their routines, identifying vulnerabilities. But orders are orders, and mercy is a luxury the Reich can no longer afford. In your pack, you carry a cyanide capsule and a Luger pistol with 1 bullet, insurance policies for when the Allies finally corner you. Because in Hitler's final gamble, even children become weapons of war, and surrender is not an option programmed into your 16-year-old mind. By late 1944, the Third Reich is collapsing faster than even its enemies anticipated. Soviet forces pour across the eastern borders, while Anglo-American armies breach the Siegfried Line from the west. Germany's cities burn under Allied bombing, its armies retreat on all fronts, and defeat has become mathematically inevitable. But Nazi leadership refuses to accept reality, instead doubling down on a final, desperate strategy that will turn the German population itself into a weapon. Heinrich Himmler creates Werewolf, named after a popular novel about guerrilla warfare, as the Nazi answer to inevitable occupation. The concept seems simple. Train civilian volunteers in sabotage, assassination, and terrorism to make Allied occupation so costly that the victors will abandon Germany rather than police a hostile population indefinitely. If the Wehrmacht cannot prevent defeat, perhaps guerrilla warfare can make victory Pyrrhic enough to force negotiated peace. The organization draws inspiration from successful resistance movements across occupied Europe, but with a crucial difference. Instead of fighting against foreign occupation, Werewolf represents a government organizing terrorism against the inevitable liberation of its own people. Nazi propagandists promise that dedicated guerrillas can transform military defeat into political victory by bleeding the occupiers until they lose the will to continue. Recruitment targets the most fanatical segments of German society. Hitler Youth members, already indoctrinated with suicidal loyalty to the regime, form the core of many Werewolf units. SS officers facing war crimes, prosecution, volunteer for operations that promise heroic death over shameful capture. Ordinary civilians, terrified by propaganda claims about Allied intentions, join cells that offer the illusion of continued resistance against hopeless odds. Training emphasizes techniques borrowed from European resistance movements the Wehrmacht spent years fighting. Sabotage operations target infrastructure, supply lines, and communications. Assassination missions focus on Allied officers, German collaborators, and anyone cooperating with occupation authorities. Most importantly, psychological warfare aims to create an atmosphere of constant threat that makes normal governance impossible. The strategic theory assumes that successful guerrilla warfare will force the Allies to commit massive resources to policing Germany, draining their strength for reconstruction efforts and creating political pressure at home to abandon occupation. Nazi planners envision a protracted campaign that turns post-war Germany into a bleeding ulcer that saps Allied resolve until they negotiate withdrawal on terms favorable to whatever remains of Nazi leadership. But reality proves far different from propaganda promises. Werewolf becomes less a strategic resistance movement than a death cult for fanatics unwilling to accept that their 1,000-year Reich lasted exactly 12 years. Life as a werewolf operative begins with training that transforms teenagers and desperate adults into instruments of suicidal terrorism. You learn to make improvised explosives from household chemicals, construct booby traps that kill indiscriminately, and plan assassination operations against targets who might be helping to rebuild your shattered country. Most importantly, you absorb psychological conditioning that makes death preferable to capture and cooperation with occupiers equivalent to treason against race and nation. Your equipment reflects the desperate improvisation of a collapsing regime. Instead of military-grade weapons, you carry hunting rifles, stolen pistols, and explosives assembled from fertilizer and industrial chemicals. Radio communications rely on captured Allied equipment or civilian sets modified for clandestine use. Maps are hand-drawn sketches of local terrain because official military cartography is unavailable to irregular forces operating without government support. Operating areas span the geographical diversity of occupied Germany, from dense forests that offer concealment to bombed-out urban ruins where guerrillas can disappear among displaced civilians. Rural operations focus on sabotaging Allied supply lines, attacking isolated outposts, and eliminating German officials cooperating with occupation authorities. Urban cells concentrate on assassination, propaganda distribution, and creating an atmosphere of constant threat that makes normal governance impossible. Safe houses exist wherever sympathetic civilians will risk execution for harboring terrorists. These might be isolated farmhouses, bombed-out buildings in destroyed cities, or hidden rooms in houses owned by Nazi sympathizers unwilling to accept defeat. The constantly shifting locations reflect the reality that werewolf operations depend entirely on civilian support that proves increasingly rare as Germans experience benevolent occupation rather than the brutality Nazi propaganda predicted. Personal survival requires skills that no military training adequately covers. You learn to forge identity documents that allow movement through Allied checkpoints. Food procurement becomes a constant challenge as rationing systems collapse and black market operations expose operatives to detection. Medical care for wounded guerrillas must avoid hospitals where Allied authorities monitor casualties for signs of insurgent activity. Communication between cells follows protocols designed to prevent infiltration, but which also limit operational effectiveness. Dead drops, coded messages, and face-to-face meetings minimize radio intercepts, but slow decision-making to crawling pace. The security measures that protect individual operatives prevent coordination of large-scale operations that might achieve strategic impact. The psychological environment proves as hostile as the physical dangers. You operate in complete isolation from normal human relationships, trusting no one completely and viewing every stranger as potential informant or Allied agent. Sleep becomes elusive as paranoia creates constant vigilance against betrayal, capture, or assassination by counterintelligence operatives who hunt guerrillas with professional efficiency. Most disturbing is the gradual realization that your operations accomplish nothing except adding to Germany's suffering. Allied forces adapt quickly to guerrilla tactics, implementing security measures that make attacks increasingly difficult, while collective punishment policies ensure that civilian populations pay the price for resistance activities. The moral weight of causing additional suffering to people who have already endured years of war creates psychological burdens that Nazi indoctrination cannot adequately address. Your role transforms from soldier defending the fatherland into terrorist, prolonging the agony of defeat while accomplishing no strategic objectives that justify the human cost of continued resistance. Death stalks werewolf operatives from directions that conventional soldiers never face. While Wehrmacht troops fought identifiable enemies on defined battlefields, guerrillas face threats from every direction. Allied counterintelligence, hostile German civilians, former comrades who choose collaboration over resistance, and the gradual psychological breakdown that comes from operating as terrorists in their own homeland. The psychological toll proves more devastating than physical dangers. Operating as terrorists in your own country creates identity confusion that Nazi indoctrination cannot resolve. You're fighting people who speak your language, share your culture, and often display more concern for German welfare than the regime you're defending. The cognitive dissonance between propaganda claims about Allied brutality and the reality of benevolent occupation destroys ideological certainty that sustained initial commitment. Equipment failures eliminate operational capabilities while exposing operatives to capture. Improvised explosives malfunction, injuring operatives or failing to detonate when needed. Stolen weapons jam at critical moments because proper maintenance requires expertise and materials that guerrillas cannot obtain. Communication devices break down, leaving cells isolated and unable to coordinate activities or request support. Counterintelligence penetration creates paranoia that prevents effective operations while exposing genuine resistance activities. Every new recruit might be an Allied agent. Every operational proposal could be a trap designed to identify cell members. Every safe house represents potential betrayal by hosts who might cooperate with authorities under pressure. The security measures necessary to prevent infiltration make accomplishing missions nearly impossible. Perhaps most insidious is the gradual realization that continued resistance serves no rational purpose except prolonging German suffering. Allied occupation proves far more benevolent than Nazi propaganda predicted. Reconstruction efforts begin improving German living conditions. Democratic governance replaces totalitarian control. The supposed benefits of continued resistance prove to be illusions created by leaders who preferred national destruction to personal defeat. Family pressure compounds operational stress as relatives plead with operatives to abandon activities that endanger entire extended families through collective punishment policies. Parents, spouses, and children become hostages to decisions made by guerrillas whose operations bring retribution against innocent people who cannot escape association with resistance activities. The mathematics of guerrilla warfare prove unforgiving for movements lacking popular support. Without civilian assistance, safe houses, and intelligence networks, even dedicated operatives cannot sustain operations for extended periods against professional counterintelligence force. The psychological impact on surviving operatives proves devastating. You realize that your actions serve no military purpose except prolonging German suffering while accomplishing objectives that benefit no one except Nazi leaders hiding in bunkers and foreign countries. The Americans respond to terrorism not with brutal repression, but with increased reconstruction efforts that demonstrate their commitment to German recovery. Local German reaction destroys whatever remained of werewolf morale. Instead of celebrating resistance against occupation, civilians openly condemn the murders as war crimes perpetrated against their own people. Church leaders denounce the killings from pulpits. Former soldiers express disgust at operations they consider dishonoring to German military traditions. Even Nazi party members distance themselves from activities they view as counterproductive terrorism. The capture of cell members reveals the complete penetration of werewolf networks by Allied intelligence. Every safe house was under surveillance. Every communication was intercepted. Every operational plan was known to authorities who allowed activities to continue only long enough to identify all participants before moving to eliminate the entire network. Under interrogation, captured operatives discover that their organization exists primarily in propaganda rather than operational reality. Higher command structures that issued orders have largely fled Germany or ceased functioning. Supply networks promised by organizers never existed. The popular support assumed by planners proves to be a fantasy created by Nazi officials who refuse to acknowledge German war weariness. The aftermath of the Penzberg operation accelerates the collapse of remaining werewolf activities throughout Bavaria and beyond. German civilians, horrified by assassinations of their own elected officials, provide comprehensive intelligence to Allied authorities about suspected guerrilla activities. Former supporters withdraw assistance rather than risk association with operations that accomplish nothing except endangering innocent people. By April 1945, most surviving werewolf operatives face a choice between surrender and suicide. The cyanide capsules distributed during training become more relevant than the weapons and explosives that prove useless against an enemy that responds to terrorism with reconstruction rather than repression. The Penzberg massacre marks the moment when even the most fanatical operatives recognize that werewolf has become a death cult that serves only to prolong agony for people who desperately need peace. The operation intended to demonstrate continued Nazi resistance instead reveals the complete bankruptcy of ideology that puts party loyalty above national welfare. What began as strategic resistance degenerates into senseless violence that benefits no one except Allied propagandists seeking examples of Nazi brutality to justify post-war policies. The numbers tell a story of comprehensive failure that defied every assumption underlying werewolf strategy. Despite Nazi propaganda claims about massive guerrilla armies, fewer than 5,000 Germans ever participated in organized resistance activities. Of these, most surrendered or abandoned operations within weeks of beginning activities. Total Allied casualties from werewolf attacks numbered fewer than 1,000, a statistically insignificant impact on occupation forces that eventually numbered over 1 million personnel. The strategic effect proved counterproductive for German interests. Instead of forcing Allied withdrawal, guerrilla attacks provided justification for extended occupation and harsher security measures. American and British authorities used werewolf activities as evidence that German society required extensive re-education and democratic reconstruction. The terrorism that was supposed to end occupation became the rationale for making it permanent and comprehensive. German civilian reaction destroyed whatever legitimacy Werewolf claimed as a resistance movement. "They weren't fighting for Germany, they were fighting against it," wrote Munich resident Maria Schmidt in 1947. "We had suffered enough. The Americans brought food, medicine, and hope for the future. These fanatics brought only more death and destruction to people who desperately needed peace." Post-war interrogations revealed the organizational chaos behind Werewolf's propaganda facade. No central command structure existed beyond Himmler's initial proclamations. Regional leaders improvised operations without coordination or strategic planning. Supply systems promised by organizers never materialized. Most critically, the popular support assumed by Nazi planners proved to be a complete fiction created by leaders who had lost touch with German public opinion. The fate of captured operatives varied dramatically based on their actions and ages. Adult leaders responsible for organizing terrorist activities faced war crimes, tribunals, and lengthy prison sentences. Teenage recruits often received rehabilitation rather than punishment, as Allied authorities recognized them as victims of Nazi indoctrination rather than genuine terrorists. Many former Werewolf members became productive citizens of democratic Germany after denazification programs addressed their ideological conditioning. The intelligence legacy influenced Allied understanding of post-conflict stabilization in ways that shaped military doctrine for decades. Counterintelligence techniques developed to combat Werewolf became standard procedures for dealing with insurgencies and subsequent conflicts. The emphasis on winning civilian support through reconstruction rather than repression established precedents that guided American military operations in Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts. Modern counterterrorism doctrine incorporates lessons learned from Werewolf's failure about the critical importance of popular support for successful guerrilla movements. Military planners understand that resistance movements without civilian backing cannot sustain operations against professional security forces equipped with adequate resources and legal authority. Perhaps most significantly, the Werewolf experience demonstrates how totalitarian movements can survive military defeat only by transforming into terrorist organizations that serve ideological rather than national interests. The Nazi leadership's willingness to sacrifice German lives for propaganda purposes reveals the fundamental difference between patriotic resistance and fanatical terrorism. The rapid collapse of Werewolf operations after Germany's surrender illustrates how quickly populations abandon extremist movements when presented with viable alternatives. German civilians chose reconstruction over resistance because Allied occupation offered genuine improvement in living conditions rather than the continued suffering that Nazi ideology demanded. Today, historians study Werewolf as an example of how not to organize post-defeat resistance. The movement's failure provides insights into the psychological, logistical, and political requirements for successful guerrilla warfare while demonstrating the self-defeating nature of terrorism that targets a movement's own population rather than legitimate military objectives. The legacy serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ideological fanaticism that prioritizes party loyalty over national welfare, and the inevitable failure of movements that lack popular support among the people they claim to represent. The next time you hear about terrorist organizations claiming to represent their people's will, remember the Werewolf guerrillas who discovered that ideology cannot survive contact with reality. When fanatics promise that violence will achieve what diplomacy cannot, think about teenagers who carried cyanide capsules into German forests to kill their own countrymen for refusing to continue a lost war. Somewhere in German archives, dusty files contain the names of young people who died not for their country, but for a party that viewed national destruction as preferable to personal defeat. They were told they were heroes defending the fatherland. In reality, They became terrorists attacking their own people's desperate desire for peace. The werewolf story reminds us that the most dangerous fanatics are often those who cannot distinguish between their cause and their country's welfare. They transform patriotism into a weapon against the very people they claim to protect, choosing ideological purity over human survival. True resistance movements fight for their people's freedom. False ones fight against their people's choices. The difference becomes clear only when the shooting stops and the rebuilding begins, and the people choose reconstruction over continued resistance to their own liberation. History remembers who they really served.